Can hear you.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, my mic was muted. Welcome to the book launch event for Florida's Healing Waters by Rick Kilby. My name is Sarah, and I'm an event planner for the Orange County Library System. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. Today's event will be moderated by Dr. Peggy McDonald, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. Dr. Peggy McDonald is a public historian and adjunct professor at Stetson University and Indian River State College. A native Floridian, Dr. McDonald gives presentations on a variety of topics in Florida history with Florida humanities. She has written about local and Florida history for Forbes Magazine, Gainesville Magazine, Our Town Magazine, and Senior Times. Dr. McDonald's first book, Marjorie Harris Carr, Defender of Florida's Environment, was published by the University Press of Florida in 2014. She is currently working on a book about Florida's female pioneers. So please welcome Peggy to our YouTube channel. Hello.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You've done a fantastic job organizing this event. It's wonderful. I think we've all been moved forward to the 21st century with our technology, thanks to you. And thank you again to the Orange County Library System for arranging this virtual book launch. It's so exciting to be here. I've had the pleasure of knowing Rick for several years, ever since I first heard him give a talk on his first book. And so I've seen with the process unfold as he's researched the second book, and there's just nothing more exciting than a book launch. I think if we can imagine the smell of opening a box of newly published books and imagine the appetizers in the corner of the room, we'll get in the spirit for this virtual book launch.
All right,
At this point, should I go ahead and give a formal introduction?
Yeah, I'm just actually going to turn it on over to you fully, and so and you can take it away.
Thank you again, Sarah. You've been so helpful.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So Rick Kilby is a Gainesville native. He grew up hunting sharks' teeth and swimming in the springs and wading through swamps. A University of Florida graduate, he has earned a living as a graphic designer since 1986 and has been self-employed since 2000. His first blog was posted in 2008 after being inspired by a trip to the tourist trap in St. Augustine. His old Florida blog now has over 875,000 views. He has delivered papers at several conferences at the Society for Commercial Archaeology and is the designer and managing editor of Reflections from Central Florida magazine. His first book, Finding the Fountain of Youth, was published in 2013 and won the Florida Book Award in the visual arts category. His second book, Florida's Healing Waters, was released this month by University Press of Florida. Rick's mission is to motivate other Floridians to appreciate the natural and historic wonders of their state. Rick, the tension has built. Can we see you now? I'd like to officially introduce you.
I'm here. So one of the reasons I wanted to have Peggy moderate this, besides her just being awesome and an incredible historian who's doing great work for the state of Florida, and especially in the area of women's history, is she was the past director of the Matheson Museum. And they had an exhibit there about health in Gainesville, and kind of Gainesville's health history. And she invited me to do a talk there about the healing waters of Florida. And at that point in the project, I was kind of stuck. I was kind of bogged down and I wasn't going anywhere. And preparing for that talk helped kind of rejuvenate myself. So I got the spark back. And had you not invited me, this book might not have ever happened. The second reason I wanted Peggy is because when she was at the Matheson, they were so incredibly helpful with imagery. And images are so important in this book. Thanks to everyone who's purchased the book already, you know that it's just loaded full of pictures. You know, obviously, I'm a graphic designer first because the images are so very important to me, which leads me into what we're going to do next. I'm going to show you a short 3-minute movie that I put together showing some of my favorite images. And a lot of those probably came from the Matheson Museum in Gainesville. So hit it, Sarah.
middle. Don't make it end. Boy, that was scandalous. All these images of men over 100 years ago with their bare legs shown bathing.
Yeah, just a word about the music. That was actually composed by Frederick Delius, who actually lived along the St. Johns River for a short time. And there's 4 movements. And Leslie Gamble from the Springs Eternal Project used one of the movements for her video with all the manatees and all the wonderful creatures of Blue Springs. This is a different movement called On the River, which was composed during the Gilded Age, so I thought it was perfect for this. And I can't get it out of my head, I'm afraid.
Oh, it's beautiful. Well, speaking of movements, let's get straight to the punch. This concept of healing waters, right? Getting back to over 100 years ago where people believed any water in a bottle might cure everything from diphtheria to menopause. How did you get interested in this concept of Florida's healing waters?
It really started with the last book. I recently saw a blog where I went to Espirito Santo Springs, which is the spa at Safety Harbor, which is still there. It was 10 years ago, which was in the middle of the research for my first book. And, you know, that's really about how the myth of the Fountain of Youth contributed to Florida history. But there's also the concept of rejuvenation and restoration, which really is health. And so I kind of tied that in. And when I look at the old book now, I can see that I was laying the groundwork for this next book, and that I was becoming fascinated with that era of Florida's history. And I remember at one point I asked Dr. Knight, who's kind of the foremost expert on Florida Springs, has anybody ever written a book about the spa era in Florida, about these incredible Victorian springs or Victorian spas that no longer exist around our springs? And he said no one had. And I just thought it was so important that we probably needed to find a way to put it all together in one book, because I think it really laid the groundwork for Florida's tourist economy that's still vital to us today.
Since you brought up your first book, Finding the Fountain of Youth, Ponce de Leon and Florida's Magical Waters, can you tell us a little bit more about your first book and how the second book is different?
The first book really grew out of an obsession, and I started collecting, I was fascinated by the Fountain of Youth and all things related to Ponce de Leon, because, our paradigm shift, where at one point conquistadors were like wonderful people, and our paradigm shifted to where we realized that, they led to the demise of all these native people, and they weren't such good people. So we started kind of getting away from that. But at one time throughout the state, there was Ponce de Leon this, Ponce de Leon that. There's Ponce de Leon Street, there's Ponce de Leon Boulevard, there's Ponce de Leon Hotel. And I started wanting to find those little vestiges that have been lost in time throughout the state. And then, I discovered a narrative, and I found out how the myth of the Fountain of Youth has been used to promote Florida forever, and still is to this day, really. And I started collecting stuff. And at some point, I had so much invested in my collection, I had to do something with it. So the book came out of that, really. And it was really because I'm obsessive more than anything else.
Well, you mentioned your collection and being obsessed. Could you tell us about some of your favorite images in the new book, which is really just eye candy for people who love Florida? Yeah,
and the new book is different because while the first book grew out of obsession, this was really my attempt to try and make a case in Florida history that invalid travel was one of the foundational aspects of the state's economy. That the people coming here for the climate and then taking the waters really helped grow the state into what it is today. And so it was from that idea that I wanted to try and find images to support that. So what I looked for was mostly images with people in it. I want to show you one of my favorites. I got props here. So this image, believe it or not, is the cover image. And that is Orange Springs. And you can see the amount of work that I had to do on it to make it work as the cover. I found that on eBay, and it was photographed by a photographer from Hawthorne, Florida. And that by far is my favorite image because there's so much going on there. You can't see in the cover. Cropped off, there's a guy standing with a camera who's taking a photograph. And there's just so much wonderful detail in that faded little photograph. And that is by far one of my favorite images, because I think in order to connect to the concept and the whole idea of taking the waters, you need to see people doing it. And that's really what I look for, is people taking the waters.
Can you tell us more about taking the waters, and tell us also if you have taken the waters and how?
I have, if anything, the contextualization of taking the waters, I kind of got carried away with. I started planning our family vacations so that we went to Arkansas so that I could go to hot springs and take the water, so I could go to Eureka Springs and do spring hunting. We went to Washington, D.C., but I went to Warm Springs, Virginia in order to take the water, the same place Thomas Jefferson took the waters, the very same bathhouse that he was in. And to me, I was geeking out for stuff like that. And it was just a kind of a pilgrimage because I wanted to put myself in their place to understand the process. Of course, the best thing was going to England to take the waters. So all roads kind of led back to Bath because they have an intact Roman bath in England because it had been built over during the Victorian era. And at one point they realized the Roman baths were buried underneath the Victorian stuff, and they unburied it. So it's pretty much an intact Roman bath with the spring water still in it. So I had to see that for myself to understand the roots of this whole notion of taking the waters.
And what did people believe would happen when they came to Florida over 100 years ago to take the waters?
So the origins of the whole idea have to do with spirituality, that originally it was believed that there were sacred powers in the water, that, there were gods and goddesses who would transfer, through a religious process to you the powers, and that water would heal you that way. But in the times of enlightenment, and as we began to realize science and started to discover, the minerals and the chemistry and all that kind of stuff, people believed that the elements in the water, like sulfur and iron in some cases, would actually be absorbed through the skin and make you feel better. So it wasn't the big first magnitude springs like Silver Springs or McCullough or Rainbow Springs that they chose to build spas at. It was the small second and mostly third magnitude springs that stunk, that had that high smell of sulfur, or the water was opaque because they knew there were minerals in the water, and that's what they believed would make you healthy. So if you go to Green Cove Springs today, you're still going to smell that sulfur, and it's really strong because that's what they desired. As far as I know, people swam in Silver Springs, but there was never a spa in Silver Springs because, the awesome beauty of the spring was what drew people there. There was no nasty smell. But, Green Springs in Volusia County is a great example. I showed it in the slideshow. It's this incredible, weird emerald color all the time, and sometimes it's a little bit more turquoise. But it's that opaque, not super clear water that people were drawn to because they believe in the power of the minerals and things that being absorbed through the skin would help restore their health.
You mentioned Green Cove Springs. The Matheson History Museum has stereographs, and many of the springs-related ones are of Green Cove Springs. And one you shared in your video, which is one of my favorites. It's girls and women at a gender-segregated part of the spring. So there's a fence so that the males cannot see them, and they're in the waters. And then the older women who are taking the waters are dressed, in late 19th century dresses. What was it about Green Cove Springs? Why are there so many stereographs, so many images?
So there wasn't a whole lot of tourism in Florida in the early part of the 19th century because much of the interior of the state was still controlled by the Seminoles and by the native population. So there were 3 wars fought against the Seminoles, and when there was hostilities going on, it wasn't good for tourism, obviously. But after the Civil War, throughout the war, there was a presence of Union soldiers in Jacksonville and Fernandina Beach, and they went back up north and they told everybody how wonderful it was. So Jacksonville was kind of ground zero for the tourism reboot after the Civil War. And there were steamboats that would go up and down as far as Enterprise, which is in Volusia County, back up to Jacksonville, and that's kind of what you did. And that's why I start the book, in the springs in the northeast corner of Florida, because that was kind of ground zero, and it took off from there. So the first big spring that was developed was Green Cove Springs when he went from Jacksonville. Magnolia Springs was before that, but there was really only one hotel there, and that was the magnificent Magnolia Springs Hotel. Green Cove Springs was very well developed. You know, it had that stinky sulfur water, and there was a huge complex of hotels that was built early on. And, you know, so during the 1870s, probably through the 1890s, I would say that was the heyday of Florida spa era, and the probably most important place was Green Cove Springs, the Saratoga of the South. So they also had all the amenities that people would want. You know, they could bowl and they could play croquet and tennis and all that kind of stuff they like to do. There was a promenade where they would walk, and promenading was very big in those days. And they would promenade back and forth on David's Walk and go up to Magnolia Springs along the river. And it's still a beautiful walk today. There's a high bluff and you can see down to the river. But it was probably the premier watering place in the state of Florida.
You mentioned the resorts, the Magnolia in particular, and there are many images of people fully dressed, right? Elaborate hats, coats, men and women fully dressed in late 19th century wear at the Springs. What would happen today if people tried to track down some of those grand resorts?
They would have a hard time finding them because most of them were made out of wood and invariably burned down. The Magnolia Hotel burned down. The Magnolia Springs Hotel burned down. The big one at Green Cove Springs, the Clarendon Hotel, burned down. The one at Swanee Springs burned down. They all burned down. You know, wood in Florida does not do well. But there are a few vestiges from that golden era of bathing if people wanted to. You could go, there's none really on a spring, but there are places where they did sea bathing, which is another aspect of my book. But from that era, you could always go to Flagler College, which has an incredible tour, which was the Hotel Ponce de Leon from that era. Right across the street is the Leitner Museum, which is the Alcazar Hotel from that era. And they had hydrotherapy facilities, which weren't springs, but were, you know, it's water from the aquifer. Some of the same things were involved there. You could also go to the Breakers. Henry Flagler originally built a resort there. Of course, the first two hotels burned down, but there's one that's from the 20s that's incredible, and it's a historic hotel. But also on the Gulf Coast, you can visit the Tampa Bay Hotel, which is now the Plant Museum, which had hydrotherapy facilities that are no longer there. And you could also go to the Bellevue Inn in Clearwater, which actually did have a spring out in the water where they bottled water and brought it in for people to drink. It was the largest wooden building anywhere at one point, but they only have one small portion of it, and it's kind of a boutique hotel. So you can always, those are, if you want to get a taste of what it was like in that era, those are good places to go and visit.
We have some questions.
Oh boy.
Joy Wallace Dickinson said that was a great eBay find, the image that became your cover photo.
Thank you.
Jane Goddard would like to know, do you have any history of the cow in the pictures? There's a gentleman riding an ox up here.
I don't have any history. You know, so travel or transportation is a big part of the story because steamboats on the St. John's and then some of the spa resorts in the interior of the state really weren't accessible until the railroads came along. But there were stagecoaches, and some of the springs were only accessible by stagecoaches. But the people who weren't rich, wealthy tourists from the north got around by ox cart mostly. So you see a lot of stage photos. You see them in St. Augustine, you see them in Green Cove Springs with ox carts. And there were these old Florida crackers, and people loved to have their pictures made because they thought it was quaint and cute with their ox carts, and you see them in photographs again and again. So I'm guessing that oxen at Orange Spring is there as a prop for people to sit on and get their photo made. It's interesting because I told you there's a guy taking a picture there. So there's a guy taking a picture of somebody taking their picture. It's a very meta thing going on there. But it was, you know, that's one of the things you did when you came down here is you had your picture made. And Green Cove Springs, they traditionally posed along the pool there in front of the Clarendon Hotel. So you see many scenes of that again and again and again.
Your brother asked, is Green Cove Springs Little Detroit?
So we grew up in Gainesville, and there was a commercial that ran all the time for Green Cove Springs. And I'm not going to sing. He almost had me do it. But Green Cove Springs is Little Detroit. Yes.
Also, people have asked about your props in the background. Could you tell us a little more about, you seem to be surrounded by people staring at you, looking over your shoulder from the springs.
That is White Sulphur Springs in the town of White Springs. And sometimes it's just called White Springs. And it probably had the most elaborate structure of any of the springs. It had a spring house that was built around it. So early on, they kind of, some of these springs were so small, they would build these rock walls in order to kind of raise the level to make the bathing area high enough for people to get into. And this one had 3 or 4 stories. And unfortunately, it was there until the 1970s, and they tore it down. But the first level is still there, and it's in White Springs, right by Stephen Foster State Park. It's worth stopping at. Unfortunately, that spring very rarely flows. If we get big rain events, it might flow. Or if we have a big enough rain event, the Swanee River will actually go back into the spring and turn it brown. Of course, that's my book cover in my books. But the 2 biggest places were White Sulphur Springs and Green Cove Springs. And ironically, the name changes. Green Cove Springs was originally called White Springs. Green Springs in Volusia County was originally called White Springs. Rainbow Springs was called Blue Springs, and we have a ton of Blue Springs in the state. So one of the difficulties in researching it is trying to figure out which name to research, because they're always changing names.
Well, speaking of difficult research, countless people in the comments are congratulating you. It is such a wonderful accomplishment to put out your 2nd book. Now, Jim Clark asks, there's always someone willing to ask about the next one. He says, will your next book be water themed?
I don't know. I will be honest. The first book was very easy because we had a hard deadline. It was the state quincentennial. And so it was really rushed into production. And so the 18-month process was really done in 9 months. And so it was easy comparatively. Where this, I was doing research probably unknowingly for about a decade. But the actual writing process from when I had my first meeting with Meredith Babb from the press to having it in my hand was over 3 years of writing every single day. And it's challenging, and it took a lot out of me. But I am interested in a lot of subjects. I am still fascinated by steamboats on the Ocklawaha River, and I am fascinated by the steamboats on the St. Johns River, because it was such a romantic era, and people were just drawn to the Ocklawaha because to them it was a spiritual experience. They would go at night and they have these big bonfires in front of the steamboats, and they would get there, and then they would, they would break, and they'd be at Silver Springs, and there'd be, infinite visibility. They could drop a coin over the side of the boat and would go down 60 feet, and you could still tell if it was heads or tails. And people just loved it. And, I grew up going on the Ocklawaha, and there's a part of it that I think is in my DNA now, and I want to do more with that. But the barge canal thing is, I just don't want to get into the barge canal thing. But, there's also tributaries of the St. John's that are fascinating to me. So I don't know, I might do something with that. I'm also really interested in the photography of the era, because the photography really is what helped kind of launch, all those people from the north coming down there. They saw these spectacular images. And, it was a big thing back then for people to have these things, these stereographs. And these slides were like pennies. And so you go into the Victorian parlor, and people would have baskets of these, and that there was no television or radio or anything. So that's what you do, is look at their stereograph collection. And so there's a huge, huge inventory of Florida images that are, done in this medium. And that's so interesting to me. So, George Barker and all these well-known photographers who really did well out west and kind of made a name for themselves came to Florida and took all these spectacular images that are available to us now. And so I'm interested in that as well.
Some people are interested in recreation. So I know in your own research, you have talked about the switch from taking the waters to approaching the springs for recreation. This would also apply to beaches. Can you tell us more about the concept of bathing, so moving into recreation?
Yeah, so one of the things in the process of getting a book published, a nonfiction book with the press, is you have to have readers. And one of the comments was they didn't see how the sea bathing and the bathing in the springs was connected. But if you study the context, the whole concept of sea bathing was kind of a new phenomenon, because during the Middle Ages, people were scared to go near the water in northern parts of Europe. You know, the Mediterranean always had a swimming tradition when the sea was a big part of their culture. But in northern Europe, you know, they were seafaring, but the normal person would not go near the water because they were afraid of it. You know, if you look at maps, there's all these sea monsters and krakens and stuff like that on the maps. So taking the waters for medicinal or healthful purposes kind of came out of the same practice as taking spring water in hot springs, because they believed that the minerals would be absorbed through your body, and also drinking seawater was good for you too. So it started in a town in England, and it kind of spread all the way to Belgium and France, where they started sea bathing. And initially people didn't swim very well. And so one of the things I noticed in the images, by that time that whole sea bathing phenomenon came back to the United States and people were doing it in Florida, they had these safety lines running out into the water. And if you look at some of the images, people are clutching these safety lines, you know, with all their strength, and they're white knuckling it because they really don't know how to swim yet. You know, the whole notion of swimming for recreation started to become in vogue at the beginning of the 19th century, but still it wasn't until the early 20th century that people were swimming recreationally. So they were going into the waters because they believed it was good for them. And they held that line. And so a lot of the pictures, even the picture on the front of the book showing that safety line, is there because people don't know how to swim. They got to hold on to that line because they can't swim yet. And they're not good swimmers.
That is fascinating. That's fascinating. Now tell me, Rick, do you believe in the healing powers of water?
I do. I really do. Honestly, throughout this whole pandemic thing, I've been craving getting in the water so bad, and I haven't found a way. I tried to go to Wakaiwa the other day, and they're limiting how many people can get in, and I wasn't there early enough, and it was closed, and I couldn't get there. And I do think it's, you know, our bodies are made out of water, and we're born in water, and I think there's something inherent in us that craves water. And one of the images I used was that picture taken by NASA from space of the state of Florida at night, and you see all the lights around the outline of the state on the beach, except for Orlando. There's a big cluster in Orlando, but otherwise it's all around the sea, you know, in the ocean, because people are drawn to the water and they want to be near water. It's soothing to look at that from a mental point of view. But I also believe, I've been to springs where people are soaking their feet in spring water. You know, all around the world, I've seen people believe in that today, and I've seen people do it. And I do believe that there's healthful. And you know, one of the pictures later in the book is from a place called Indigo Float, which is a pod experience that's kind of a deprivation take, where you take the waters. It's the same kind of stuff, where if you look at the list of maladies that can be healed by floating in those isolation pods, it's real similar to what you would have seen in the 19th century coming to a spring in Florida. The only thing that has changed is the language. So we're not talking about dropsy and consumption and things. We're talking about 21st century maladies that you can be healed by taking the waters or soaking in isolation. Float pod, I should say.
Could you tell us more about that continuing through the 20th century sense of hydrotherapy? And I know on your travels when you were researching this book, that these are some of the places that you visited that still exist, right? Could you tell us a little bit about these old-fashioned views of hydrotherapy that continue today?
Well, one of the things that interested me, because it was the medical history component, and that's what I got involved in studying when I did that talk at the Matheson, is that there was kind of an alternative medical history that came around in the 19th century, because that was the era of heroic medicine. So if you got sick, they believed in the humors. So there were 4 humors, and it was like blood and phlegm and black bile and yellow bile. And if they were out of whack, they would do stuff like bleed you or give you leeches. It was also the era of patent medicine. So, you know, there was all this medicine with mercury and cocaine and alcohol in it. So the medicine would make you worse. So there was this alternative track. So, you know, vegetarianism and naturopathy and all these things started to develop, and they were very closely tied to some of the religious movements at the time. And some of the practitioners were, people who we know were more progressive. They were abolitionists and suffragettes and people like that. And one of the practices they did was called the water cure. And it was mostly in the Northeast. And it's from practices of cold water that really evolved in Germany, in Belgium, in Czechoslovakia, and came over to this country. And so this didn't require spring water or salt water. It was really just wrapping yourself in water or having water run on you, or in some cases just walk on wet grass in bare feet. And they believed it was good for you. So there were all these water cure establishments throughout the North, and they eventually evolved into sanitariums. And sanitariums kept a lot of the hydrotherapy treatments. And there was a whole sanitarium movement that involved being outside and having hydrotherapy practice. And it spread down to Florida. And so some of my travels I did so I could do some of these hydrotherapy things. And that's why I really went to hot springs. Even though they have springs there, the stuff they do are things you could do anywhere with regular tap water, like sit on a sitz bath and get a needle shower, or wrap yourself in wet sheets, all those kind of practices that have been going along for years and years and years, and have roots that go back to ancient Europe.
Fascinating. Can you tell us, around this time, you have Kellogg and the cereal and graham crackers and enemas and all these bizarre treatments. Do we know if anyone like a Kellogg, for instance, came to Florida to take the waters?
Well, we know that Kellogg had a spa here, and it was so gratifying to find that he did that, because he was such a pioneer in medicine. He's such a wacky dude. If you have a chance to see The Road to Wellville, that movie, he is so goofy. He's just like that, where in some ways he was way ahead of his time. He's working on creating soy-based foods for vegetarians, but he was also into eugenics, and he really believed in colonics all the time. And, so you ate and then you went and got rid of the stuff constantly. But his Battle Creek Sanitarium, everybody went there because it was such a big deal. So presidents went there, all the celebrities went there, hundreds of thousands of people went there because it was the thing to do. Well, he had a branch of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Miami Springs at this incredible hotel that was built in this Pueblo Mission Art Deco style. And he did the same kind of practices. He really stressed a lot of sun treatments, but he had hydrotherapy stuff is there. He was a big believer in hydrotherapy. He trained at one of the water cures, and he wrote several books on water treatments. And so one of my favorite discoveries was that one of Orlando's early mayors, a guy named Malin Gore, who was a progressive mayor who ran the newspaper, wrote to John Harvey Kellogg in Battle Creek and said, there's a sanitarium on this lake here. You guys got to come down and have a branch down here. And so the Adventist Church bought the sanitarium and opened up Florida Sanitarium. And today, that's Advent Health, one of the biggest hospital chains anywhere.
Wow.
And it started in a letter from an Orlando mayor to John Harvey Kellogg.
Wow, that's so exciting. Carol Strickland asks, can you discuss bottling spring water? Espirito Santo, of course, we know Magnesia Springs and other Florida springs had their water bottled. Can you tell us a little about that?
Espirito Santo Springs is in Safety Harbor, and it is one of my favorite places in Florida. I almost don't want to talk about it because I'm afraid it'll get ruined. It's so old Florida, and it's so wonderful, and the spa is still there. It was discovered supposedly when there was a Fort Brooke there, that when they were fighting against the Seminoles. There's two stories. One is that the Seminoles showed this guy, one of the soldiers there, the springs. And then the other story is he had the Seminoles as captives, and they were not doing well, so he took them there to get healed. Anyways, this guy ended up buying the springs and developing a spa there, and it started out kind of as camping, and then eventually facilities were built there. And there was 5 springs, I believe, and they all had different things they would cure. There's kidney springs and liver springs and beauty springs in case you needed help with beauty and stuff like that. And it became a sanitarium, but somehow, unlike the other springs, it has managed to stay relevant throughout history and is still there today. So you can still go and take the waters there and stay in a modern spa. So you can get seaweed wraps and all that kind of other stuff and you can also bathe in the spring water. But at some point, they bottled the water, and there's incredible images of these taps they would have in this octagonal bar shaped in there. And that room where the water was bottled is still there today. It's kind of a conference room. And the sign is still there in the beauty salon. It's actually in the book with all the different types of water. Water number 1 will do this. Water number 2 will do this. Water number 3 will do this. Water number 4 will do this. So that history, is alive today. And they actually have kept one of the hotel rooms intact from that era, from the 1920s, that you can see, so you can see firsthand what it would be like to go there and take the waters.
That's so cool. You mentioned being afraid to mention it, not wanting it to draw too much attention to it. One of you asked, are we loving the springs to death? I know there was recently a news article about Weeki Wachee and about kayaks damaging the edges. Can you tell us a little more about that in terms of our popularity of the springs, and are we loving them to death?
Yes, we are. That was one of the ironies in my first book, that the myth of the Fountain of Youth was used to bring people to the state for years and years and years, and it worked so well that our fountains of youth are now imperiled. And so there's a lot of things that work here. There's the population. We've take so much water from the aquifer that the flow is not nearly what it used to be, and so that results in more of the stuff staying in the springs. And a lot of the nutrients that are in people's lawns end up in the springs and can't get washed out because the flow is less, and so it's a kind of a catch-22. But also, since I've been involved with this process, I've really seen the popularity of springs go, through the roof. And spring hunters and everything like that have become more and more popular, which is a great thing in some respects. And I love people that appreciate them, but they are not what they used to be. When I was a kid and I would go to Silver Springs, the bottom looked like sand. I mean like snow. It was, it was crystal clear, and it was pure white sand. And now it's like green shag carpeting. It's nasty and gunky and horrible. And it's because there's too many people in the state, too many people put fertilizing near their lawns. And unfortunately, a lot of the resources get trashed just by recreation. So there's a lot we need to do better in order to take care of our springs.
I feel like we grew up with the same Florida. I'm also a Gainesville native and grew up exploring for shark's teeth at Hogtown Creek. So don't knock the green shag. We had it in our house.
We did too.
One viewer mentioned, all she said was Florida transportation. A while back, you were talking about the St. John's and the Ocklawaha, which of course, when the first snowbirds came in the winter to see the springs, they came via the St. John's and of course traveled on the Ocklawaha. Can you tell us a little more about that? In other words, how originally Florida tourism was centered in North Florida?
Yeah, like I said before, a lot of it had to do with the Union soldiers stationed there. But even before that, there really weren't that many big cities in Florida at the beginning of the 19th century. There was Pensacola in the west, Jacksonville in the east, and Key West, and that was really it. So Jacksonville was kind of the hub, and throughout all the Seminole Wars, Jacksonville and St. Augustine were pretty much insulated from a lot of the hostilities. So, in the 1820s, Ralph Waldo Emerson went to St. Augustine, for healing purposes for his consumption of tuberculosis. So, it was a safe haven from a lot of the stuff that was going on during the Seminole Wars. So it was very easy for sailing ships and then steamboats to come down from New York to Charleston and Savannah and then to Jacksonville. So it was just more accessible. And then from there, get on a steamboat. And then Palatka kind of overnight went from being a big lumbering town to a tourist destination. And they had these incredible wooden hotels that, of course, all burned down. And people would go there and spend the night and then go up the Ocklawaha because, like I said, it was what you did. It was like you would not, in the 19th century, it was akin to going to Disney World. You would not go back up north and say, I did not go to Silver Springs and see the Ocklawaha River. It's what you did.
You mentioned Ralph Waldo Emerson coming here because he had consumption. He had TB, and so he was ordered to come here to take the waters. I wonder just how many examples we have of people coming here for TB. Dr. Robert Lee Robb, husband of Dr. Sarah Lucretia Robb in Gainesville, moved here because it was doctor's orders that he needed to come to Alachua County, and it was really to let the climate cure him. He did recover from his TB. Did you find any evidence or any records related to how many people who came to Florida to take the waters experienced health benefits?
You know, I have this great primary source material that I found late in my research that, well, I would probably utilize more whenever I get to go out and do book talks, about a guy named Kyer who owned a brewery, and he came down here because he was in really bad health. And they were very wealthy. You know, he was a millionaire in the 19th century. And I have the letters he wrote back, that his wife wrote back to his daughter, and they would go from place to place and place. And so the place that brought them the most relief of any of the places they visited was Swanee Springs on the Swanee River. And what they complained about, whereas Green Cove Springs and White Springs had kind of towns with all the amenities you could want, Swanee Springs was still kind of isolated. So everything was on the resort property, but there was really no town that developed it. So they were bored, and it rained the whole time, and they were there, and they were pretty miserable, but the spring water seemed to do well for him. In addition to that, I did find, and I need to start keeping a list of all these people who came here originally for health reasons. Flagler first came to Florida because his wife was sick. He wasn't much impressed, and he really didn't fall in love until he came back with his next wife, who was his wife's nurse. And one of the pioneers of Orlando who helped Orlando become Orlando, who was a big promoter, was a writer named Will Wallace Harney. And he came down because his wife was sick. And unfortunately, she didn't make it. So, you know, there were people who were healed and there were people who didn't make it. And a lot of the travel writings of the time say, don't come down here and expect miracles. You know, it was almost like a disclaimer. It's like, you have to exercise, you have to get outside, you have to, walk around, you have to take the waters, you have to do all this. But if you're at death's door, don't come down here expecting a miracle. But a lot of people did, just because life was so sedentary where a lot of these people came from. The whole notion of getting outside in the sunshine during the winter and doing all that stuff, that is an important thing to note. These people are so elegantly dressed, one, because it's the Victorian era, and that's how you dress in the Victorian era. You didn't show ankle. The other thing, it's the winter. The season was, December, January, February through March or April, May at the latest. Nobody was here in summer, except for the Florida crackers. The air conditioner was years away from being invented. So, there were some resorts that differentiated themselves by staying open all year long. Henry Flagler had one in Jacksonville Beach called the Atlantic Hotel. And it tried to do that, but it didn't make it. And Swanee Springs tried to do that too, and tried to appeal to people from southern Georgia more so than people up north. But the majority of people coming in this golden age of bathing were people from up north who came here in the winter.
Victoria Griffin writes, she wonders if you had to be very wealthy to make that trip to save someone's life, to move to Florida. What are we looking at? Are these middle-class travelers? What are these, the elites? Who are these people?
These are definitely wealthy people, because initially, as transportation evolves, it gets less expensive. So as, the rail system gets better, upper middle class people could afford it. But originally, you had to, when they first started, you'd have to get on a sailing ship in New York and sail to the Carolinas and sail to Jacksonville and then get on a steamboat. So you're constantly having to incur more costs. The Kyer letters that I have, they're moving around from hotel to hotel. So they're having their luggage shipped. They're going on steamboats, they're going on trains. It is not cheap. I mean, it's cheap to relative standards. You could stay at the best hotel for a couple bucks, but that's a lot of money back then. So, and that's another reason why these people look so good in all these photographs, because they're wealthy and they're showing off their good clothes. And I mentioned promenading. It was one of the things that you did, because part of it was to be seen and to see others, and you wanted to wear your best. So eventually my book it really covers the Gilded Age. So at the age of the automobile, I stretch it a little bit into the mid-century, but that's when it becomes more accessible. When people, the tin can tourists, start to come to Florida who can afford to come here because they're, driving their own car and they're eating out of tin cans, and there's not much cost associated with it. That's when you get people who aren't super wealthy come into the state.
I also wonder about African Americans having the opportunity to take the waters. There's one of my favorite images from the Matheson History Museum it's titled Negro Baptism from White Springs, and it's dozens of African American men and women dressed in white with the baptism going on, and it really shows a different type of healing waters. Did you find evidence of other areas where there was access? Because we know in the 20th century, there was nowhere to swim, and that's why Mary McLeod Bethune established what's now known as Bethune Beach, or we have American Beach. What did African Americans do? Were they able to gain access to the healing waters?
So a lot of African Americans were utilized as staff at a lot of these resorts, but I haven't found any evidence that they were admitted to, the swimming pools at these resorts. I talk about Milwaukee Springs, which is near Gainesville. I feel like there's a whole story there, and I know there was somebody doing research at the Matheson recently who had uncovered a whole lot. And Milwaukee Springs was developed after World War II for African Americans for rehabilitation purposes, and I just haven't been able to find that much stuff on it. But there is a huge spiritual component, and there are wonderful images of African American baptisms at these waters all over the state, from the Ichetucknee to the Suwannee to De Leon Springs. There's in Volusia County, there's incredible images, and there's a whole lot of work that could be done there, and I really just scratched the surface. And I wish I had the time and the resources to do more work on that.
Maybe that's another book.
Could be.
David Moritz asked, well, first he says, thank you for your books, Rick. They remind me of better days in Florida. Along those lines, I wonder, what can Floridians do to help improve the water quality at our springs?
So I know no one's heard this recently. They could vote. And, the thing is, around election time, a lot of people pretend they're environmentalists, but, you really need to invite people or elect people who are environmentalists full-time and not just at election time, because we have not been electing people who care about our environment. And, that's an important thing. But a lot of it is we can do right in our own backyards. Literally, if you have a yard full of St. Augustine grass and you're putting turf builder on it and watering it all the time, you're not helping our springs, because water that is withdrawn from the aquifer is in most cases going to evaporate and not recharge the aquifer, especially if you're watering your lawn in the middle of the day or hours that are warm. And that's a big part of it. There's not nearly the flow that there used to be in our springs. And when you're putting stuff, pesticides and stuff like that, it eventually ends up in our springs. So I'm really making a concerted effort myself to plant native plants in my yard that don't need to be watered and don't need any kind of pesticide application or fertilizer. And I love it because I have incredible butterflies and caterpillars and all kind of an ecosystem developing that brings me so much pleasure. And I don't miss the grass and the maintenance required a bit. We need a paradigm shift so that's no longer the standard. The perfect manicured lawn is no longer desirable, and that will go a long way to helping us.
25 years ago, I interviewed the writer Harry Crews, one of my favorite fiction writers. He wrote Southern Gothic, and that's one thing he said. He refused to mow a lawn. But along those lines, Cynthia Barnett has written extensively about what you're referring to with Mirage and Blue Revolution and Rain. So if readers are interested more in how in Florida or anywhere can we stop consuming so much water, can we help the springs? And you also mentioned the Springs Eternal Project, which has practical solutions for, and also just to help people understand their individual impact upon the environment. Bonita Moore says she just wants to say that your book is beautifully designed. And this is a real compliment coming from an expert in graphic design. Yeah. And she says the typography, historic photography, and layout is superb. It will become a gift item for all my friends and family. I agree. With your first book, I gave it as a present for years. Christmas, birthdays, it was the perfect present. And this one also mails well. It's beautiful, a beautiful cover, but it's also soft. So it mails well. And one thing that hooks people is the images. The images are just exquisite. And it reminds me of the type of eye candy that we see on Old Florida. And one thing I love is that you have this incredibly successful Old Florida blog and Facebook page and Tumblr, and yet you're so humble and you never talk about it. But it is the inspiration that helps people fall in love with Florida. Can you talk a little bit about that? How did you wind up being Mr. Old Florida?
Well, I always trace all this to a trip in 2008 to the Fountain of Youth attraction in St. Augustine. My family and I were staying at what used to be I guess it's still the Howard Johnson's right outside. And I wanted to go in, and I went there, and I was just, it wasn't this cheesy tourist attraction. It was amazing. There's so much history there. And I realized the stuff that I had taken for granted in this state, there might be more to it. And I hadn't done a good job of getting out there and seeing this stuff, the state parks and all the historical sites. And so that's kind of when I started my blog, and kind of when I started doing the book too, unknowingly, that I was, coming up with a narrative in my head, and I would start collecting places and things and experiences that would contribute to all of that. And, there's a whole lot of cool stuff in the state. And a lot of people who move here don't realize the layers of history we have in the state. But one of my favorites is Manatee Mineral Springs. Such a great story, and it's just now coming to light. They now consider a stop on the Underground Railroad, because there were these Maroons, these Black Seminoles, who lived there and had this whole community, and were eventually run out by Andrew Jackson. And a lot of them, some of them were captured, hundreds of them were captured, but a lot of them escaped to the Bahamas. So the people who lived near Manatee Mineral Springs, their descendants still live in the Bahamas. So they have done all this archaeology, and it's considered a stop on the Underground Railroad. And they have a festival now where people come back from the Bahamas with their Junkanoo bands and all that kind of stuff to celebrate that heritage. And so there's places like that all over the state. There's stories like that all over the state. And so I started the Old Florida stuff to try and get people to appreciate the state more. It's really easy to complain about what's no longer here, but there's still a lot of good stuff here. And if we want it to be preserved, we need to change people's consciousness and make them realize it's important.
That is such a good message. I wonder at this point if you could tell people, how do they get your book?
Well, you can get a discounted copy from the publisher and with free shipping at upf.com. Use the code Kilby, Kilby. But if you'd like an autographed copy from me, go to my website, rickkilby.com, and I will sign it and send it to you personally. So there's two ways to order. Of course, it's always on Amazon. I wish if you have a local bookstore that's open, consider buying it there or ordering it from them. There's great independent bookstores all across the state. That would be a wonderful thing to do. I look forward to being able to do book events with in-person bookstores again, because they're such an incredible resource. And one of my favorite things is going to these great bookstores and going to the Florida section. That's what I do first. And I find all these great things. They're out of print, or the Muse bookstore in DeLand is one of my favorites. They have a whole room that's Florida stuff. And I always find great treasures there. And I can't wait till I can do that again, because Florida is so cool. It just is. And there's so many great books. You're great. Your book is great. I was fortunate enough to have, other people who contributed to this book are some of my favorite people: Gary Monroe, John Moran, Leslie Gamble. The list goes on and on and on and on. All these wonderful people who made contributions to Florida history and brought some of these stories to life.
That's wonderful, Rick. I'd also like to go out on a wing and suggest that
Please do.
You have such a compelling story, and that's how we became friends. I heard you speak at the Matheson before I worked there, and I'd never heard Florida history talked about in the way you presented it, and it was fascinating. And there's a blend of history and environmentalism and art that was just so intriguing. Are you available to give virtual presentations to organizations? And how would people arrange that to have you give a virtual talk?
I believe they can contact me through my email. I also have a Facebook page for Florida's Healing Waters. Yeah, it's been interesting because I was fortunate enough with the first book to doing talks 5 or 6 years after the book came out, still about that subject. And the truth is, by the end of that, I was already talking about the new book. And because I was really immersed in that. I do have a couple other talks. I'll be talking about Florida springs that became roadside attractions in November, on November 11th, for the Society for Commercial Archaeology, which is an organization of like-minded people who love roadside stuff. And so I'll talk about Silver Springs and Rainbow Springs and all that kind of stuff. And then I will be doing a talk that's going to be a podcast in December, and I'm not sure when that's going to air, about the spiritual side of water, because that's another part that it really interests me, because there is a whole spiritual component that is, I could have done volumes just on water's origins and the origins of the spirituality and the sacredness of water, because there's so much there in cultures all across the globe. I stuck mostly to the Western European stuff because that had the most impact on what we in the United States did. But there's the whole Eastern, there's still hot springs. There's a big tradition in Japan. And that's one of the things I'd love to do, is take the waters in Japan.
Julie points out, as a good wife would, that there's beautiful work in the book by James Kilby, your brother. And Joy Wells Dickinson points out that the Friends of the Library bookstore at the Orlando Public Library, she's not sure if it's open now, but it's a great source for Florida books.
It is. And just to give a shout out to the library, I did a lot of research there, because on the 4th floor, they have original first edition 19th century travel publications in the stacks. And they have a scanner there. You can scan high res stuff too. And so to me, going back in the stacks was like traveling back in time, to actually hold these things and see the original engravings, that were letterpress into the books, and feel the grooves in the page and everything. It's a great thrill.
Oh, also, Deborah Wood asked, do you autograph every book from your website? She did not see a place to request that. So people want your signature on the book.
Yeah, if you buy it from me, I will sign it. And I also give people a little postcard too, with the book on it too. Oh, we should do a giveaway. Do we have time for a giveaway?
Why not?
So, first person who can tell me what year Ponce de Leon, or as you said, Ponce de Leon, arrived in Florida, will win a copy of my old book, Finding the Fountain of Youth. First person in the comments.
I have my eye on the comments. Larry Reynolds says, great program, great book. Thank you, Rick.
Are they running the credits? They're probably running the credits, and we don't even know.
I don't think so.
Oh, Leslie Kempool wins! So I'm actually, Leslie Kempool is another University Press of Florida author who's working on another book. I think she just has one coming out soon with Jack Davis. And I'm going to talk to her class at Rollins. I'm looking forward to that. I'm excited about that.
Awesome. And your mother, Pat, says your dad would be so proud. That's such a wonderful message.
Just a shout out to my dad. I wanted to wear this earlier, but it wouldn't fit over my headphones. This is my dad's hat. And I like to always have something on my dad's around when I do a talk as a tribute to him. I don't know why he had this hat, but it's the coolest thing ever.
It's perfect with the bow tie.
Yeah. So
awesome.
Thanks for that, Mom. Thanks for watching. Thanks to all my friends and family. Thank you, everyone who's purchased my book. It's grateful. I visualized this book launch. It was going to be a Castafiles. It was on the calendar, and the pandemic came. But you guys watching this means a lot to me, and I'm grateful. And thank you, Peggy. And thank you, Sarah.
All right. Awesome. RickKilby.com.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to find out when we have new fun and informative videos for you. Orange County Library System is your place to learn, grow, connect.